Welcome to CSP 340, Chapter 6, Specific Learning Disabilities and ADHD. We begin with a diagnosis and definition of specific learning disabilities. In your book, they have the federal definition, and it says, in general, that it's a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, read, spell, write, or do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, motor disabilities, mental retardation, emotional disturbance, environmental, cultural, economic disadvantage. Well, that sure is some dry stuff. That's legal language. So let's see if we can figure out what each one of those means. So what we're going to look at first is we're going to look at the idea of basic psychological processes. When we look at basic psychological processes, what we mean by that is perception, attention, memory, and executive function. So when we're talking about perception, we're talking about how your body communicates to you the world around you. So we're talking about visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile perception. So you know what visual perception is. It's how you perceive things visually. So this is not talking about visual acuity or how clearly you see, like you have 20/20 vision, or you need to wear glasses. With perception, it's how your brain is interpreting what it sees. So when you look at, if you can think about optical illusions, that's a good example about how our visual perception can be different. Other examples would be, you notice sometimes you'll be wearing, say, a sweater, and somebody will say, well, that sure is a pretty purple sweater, and you think to yourself, this is not purple, this is blue. That's visual perception. That it's not a matter of perception being right or wrong, it's a matter of perception may be different. We have the same thing with auditory perception, how your brain is interpreting what it's hearing. Tactile perception has to do with how things feel, and kinesthetic perception has to do with how it feels to move. So we have all of those areas of perception, and then we have attention. So attention is necessary for accurate perception. So when we're talking about attention, we typically talk about sustained attention, which is being able to attend to something long enough to be able to perceive what you're truly seeing. And then we also talk about selective attention, whether I'm attending to the right elements of what it is that I'm looking at. So a good example, most of you are in an age range where you remember the Where's Waldo books, where they would have a scene on the beach, and there on that beach you would have Waldo, who had wore a striped shirt and a stocking cap. And so what you had to do was to look for Waldo, but the entire beach would be covered with other little tiny figures. So you had to pick Waldo out from the crowd. That required you to have selective attention to know what you were looking for. And it also required you to have sustained attention, which meant you had to pay attention long enough to find what you wanted to do. So then another part of psychological processes is memory. So we've got visual memory, we've got auditory memory, we've got kinesthetic memory, and we've got tactile memory. And so for me to be able to perceive it, to store it well, then that means that I had to pay attention long enough to see the elements of what I was supposed to see, hear, feel, or move. But then I also have to store that in the right kind of memory. And so we'll talk later about different types of memory. But we have verbal memory, where you can remember words. We've got sequential memory, where you remember things in order. You've got digit memory, which is memory of numbers. So there are all kinds of different memory. You remember there's short-term memory and there's long-term memory. So we have a lot of different kinds of memory. And then last part of perception or the psychological processes is executive function. And that's how your brain organizes your perceptions, your attention, your memory. And one of the biggest problems we see with the group of kids we call ADHD, which is what we're going to talk about later, is that they don't organize their perceptions and their memories well, and so they have trouble retrieving them. This is also a problem that kids with learning disabilities have. So the next thing we have are the 8 areas of discrepancy. You remember on the definition, it talked about manifests itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about what are the areas that we say are actually part of the areas that you can have a discrepancy between ability and achievement. So what we talk about in learning disabilities is 8 different areas of discrepancy. There are 3 in reading fluency, which is how fast and accurately you can read. Basic reading, which is can you word call? Can you actually identify which words are which? Reading comprehension, which is can you understand what's being read? Then there are 2 kinds of math. Math calculation, add, subtract, multiply, divide, and then math reasoning, which is your higher maths, but it also includes things like measurement and time. And then we have 3 language skills. We have spoken language, we have written language, and we have listening. So as part of this definition of LD, what we have is we have the idea that these are the content areas that people are going to have trouble with as a result of these perceptual or psychological processing difficulties. And then the last part of the definition is the exclusion clause. So the exclusion clause says, here's what's not included. It's not learning problems that are primarily the result of vision or hearing. So we have to do a vision test and a hearing test before we decide a child has a learning disability, or motor disability. So we're going to talk in a few minutes about some of the types of learning disabilities there are, and some of them could be caused simply because you have some sort of neurological problem that doesn't allow you to do it. It's not a learning disability, it's just physically you can't do what you need to do. It also cannot be the result of mental retardation, low IQ below 70. It cannot be the result of emotional disturbance. We find that kids with emotional disturbance, and this will be chapter 8, that children with emotional disturbance have much lower achievement than their IQ would indicate. So we've got to rule out, is this an emotional cause? And then it also can't be the result of cultural or economic disadvantage. So the kid has to have had an opportunity to learn. And so then the last part of this definition is definition and diagnosis slide is how do we diagnose learning disabilities. The first thing is that we can look at this discrepancy between ability and achievement. In these 8 areas, we can do testing in each of these 8 areas and compare those test results to the child's IQ. And if there's 15-point discrepancy between IQ and achievement in any one of these areas, then we say they have a learning disability in that area. So if I have an IQ of 100 and my reading fluency score is 80, then that is more than a 15-point discrepancy. That, in fact, is a 20-point discrepancy. And you could say that I have a learning disability in reading fluency. You could have a learning disability in any one of these 8 areas, or any combination of these 8 areas. The other way that we diagnose a learning disability is through RTI. You remember from chapter 2 in your book where we talked about RTI, where you have a child who's not achieving in the class the way he should, and we take him through that 3-tier model, and each time we increase the amount of intervention for that child, and at the end of those 3 tiers, we say this child did not respond to intervention, and so therefore they have a learning disability. The next thing we're going to look at is the characteristics of learning disabilities. If you've done your activities, one of your activities was Misunderstood Minds. And Mel Levine, who was the founder of All Kinds of Minds and one of the people that those films were based on, made this statement: when you're a kid, School is your career. And if you go out of business in school, if your business goes bankrupt, if you're not having any success, you're left with almost nothing. You're poverty stricken. Where do you go from there? What happens to the kids that don't make it in school? That's the question that Dr. Levine had. And so we're going to look at the different kinds of learning disabilities. The first one that we look at is dyslexia, and this is how most people look at dyslexia. You see the dog, and he's having trouble saying bark. Dyslexia is not reading words backwards. Dyslexia is a problem with accessing written code. And so what happens with dyslexia is the person has trouble decoding those letters that are on a page. They have trouble breaking words into sounds. They have trouble putting letters together to make words. They have trouble seeing where words break off. They have trouble seeing the lines between the spaces between lines. It looks to them like everything is rolling together on the page. The second example we have here, it says dyslexia at the bottom, but this is dysgraphia. You can see it says, here's a sample of my writing, which I'm giving you to look at and like you to think about. This is the way that I wrote until I was in about 7th grade, and I checked a book out of the library to teach myself how to write. Dysgraphia has to do with directionality. It has to do with motor eye-hand coordination, fine motor skills. The person sees that what they're writing is wrong, but they have trouble making their hand go the direction that they want it to go. When I write the letters B, D, G, P, and Q, I have to stop and think about which side the stick goes on, and does the stick go up or down? And that's very typical of people with dysgraphia. Dyscalculia has to do with being able to calculate. And so you can see some of the problems here with dyscalculia: remembering specific facts and formulas, following sequential directions. It also, you think of it as being math, but you may not know this. There's a very strong connection between math and music. So learning musical concepts, being disoriented left and right, abstract concepts of time and direction, dealing with money, spatial orientation, where you are in space. People with dyscalculia run into things. You say, what does that have to do with math calculation? No, it's what does math calculation have to do with left and right and spatial. Telling and keeping track of time. So it's not just math calculation, it's a matter of left and right, up and down. So we're going to look at some teaching ideas for learning disabilities. On this page, it talks about dyscalculia, and it talks about what the problems are. By the way, this handout is on your Canvas home page. On the right, it has pages, and this one is there on those pages. So I'm not going to go over this in detail with you, but what this does is it breaks down what to do with dyscalculia, what to do with dysgraphia, and what to do with dyslexia. In the next film, the next video, we will look at ADHD.